Sir, you remind me of my late father, she said to the elderly single dad at a cafe, and what happened next changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Aubrey Patterson had been going through the motions for 10 months straight, and if you'd asked anyone who knew her, they would have said she was doing fine, handling things really well actually. But the truth was, she'd been operating on autopilot since the morning her mom called at 6:15 a.m. and said in a voice that didn't sound like her voice at all, "Honey, your dad had a heart attack. He didn't make it. He's gone." And Aubrey's entire world had just stopped right there in her kitchen holding a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Daughter" that her dad had given her as a joke 2 Christmases ago. She was 33 years old, working as a pharmacy technician at a CVS in a suburb outside Milwaukee. And she'd thought she had all this time left to call her dad more often and visit on weekends that weren't holidays and tell him she appreciated all the stuff he'd done for her growing up. But then time just ran out without warning, and now she was stuck in this weird limbo where she couldn't cry and couldn't feel much of anything except this dull, constant ache that lived right behind her ribcage. Every morning before her shift started at 9, she'd stop at this little corner cafe called Brennan's that made halfway decent coffee and had these blueberry muffins that were probably a day old, but she didn't care. And the routine of it was the only thing keeping her tethered to normal life. Walk in, order the same thing, sit in the same corner booth for 20 minutes, scroll through her phone without actually reading anything, then head to work and spend 8 hours counting pills and answering the same insurance questions over and over. The cafe had regulars like any place does. The construction guys who came in at 5:30, making noise and laughing too loud. The retired teachers who met up for their book club every Wednesday. The young mom with twins who always looked like she was about 3 seconds from a breakdown. And this older man who came in every single morning at 7:45 with a little girl who had to be his granddaughter based on the age gap. Aubrey had been seeing them for probably 2 months before she actually paid attention. The old guy had to be in his early 60s at least. Gray hair that was thinning on top, weathered face like someone who'd spent a lot of years working outside, always wore these faded flannel shirts and jeans that had seen better days. And the little girl was maybe 7 or 8 with braids that were slightly crooked, like he'd done them himself without really knowing how. They had this routine down. They'd come in and he'd order her a hot chocolate and himself a black coffee, and they'd sit at the table by the window and she'd pull out homework or a coloring book and he'd help her, or just sit there reading the newspaper, the actual physical newspaper, not on a phone. And there was something about watching them that made Aubrey's chest hurt in a way she couldn't name. It was a random Tuesday in the early March when Aubrey first heard it. She was sitting in her usual booth, half watching the old man and the little girl. And he was stirring sugar into his coffee, doing that thing people do, where they're not really thinking about it. And he was humming under his breath, and the song made Aubrey's entire body go rigid, because she knew that song. It was Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette, the original version, not the covers. And her dad used to hum it exactly like that. Same cadence, same little pause before the chorus. He'd hummed it while cooking breakfast, while fixing things around the house, while driving her to school when she was little. The sound of it hit Aubrey like a physical thing, and she had to put her coffee down because her hands started shaking, and she just sat there staring at this stranger who had no idea he was ripping open something in her that had been sealed shut for 10 months. She didn't approach him that day. She just left the cafe feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach and cried in her car for 5 minutes before pulling herself together enough to drive to work. And her coworker Jenny asked if she was okay, and Aubrey said, "Yeah, just allergies," which was a garbage excuse in March, but Jenny didn't push it. But the next Tuesday, Aubrey found herself watching for the old man and the little girl, and sure enough, 7:45 they walked in. Same routine. And when he sat down and started stirring his coffee, he did it again, hummed that same song in that same way. And Aubrey felt tears burning behind her eyes because how was this possible? What were the odds that this random stranger in a random cafe would have the same unconscious habit as her dad? 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of Aubrey sitting there listening to this man hum her father's song while his granddaughter did her homework. And she started noticing other things too. The way he was patient when the little girl struggled with reading. The way he'd make animal shapes out of sugar packets to make her laugh when she got frustrated. The way he looked tired in a bone-deep way that suggested he was carrying way more than he'd signed up for. Aubrey's therapist, the one she'd finally started seeing 2 months ago, when her mom had basically forced her to go, kept telling her she needed to find ways to connect with her grief instead of avoiding it. And Aubrey had thought that was the most useless advice she'd ever heard, because what did connecting with grief even mean? But sitting there watching this old man be gentle with this little girl while humming her dead father's favorite song felt like something was cracking open in her chest. On a Thursday morning in late March, Aubrey made a decision that was probably crazy, but she couldn't not do it anymore. She waited until the old man got up to refill his coffee at the counter, and she walked over to the table where the little girl was coloring and said, "Hi there. I'm sorry to bother you. Is it okay if I talk to your grandpa for a second?" And the little girl looked up with these big brown eyes and said, "He's not my grandpa, he's my papa. My daddy died, so papa takes care of me now." In that matter-of-fact way kids have when they've explained something 100 times. And Aubrey felt her throat get tight and said, "Okay, is it all right if I talk to your papa?" And the girl shrugged and went back to her coloring. The old man came back to the table and saw Aubrey standing there, and his face did this confused, polite thing, like he was trying to figure out if he knew her from somewhere. And Aubrey's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she made herself say it. "Sir, I'm so sorry to interrupt your morning. I know this is going to sound really weird, but you remind me of my late father, that song you hum when you stir your coffee. Stand by your man. My dad used to hum it exactly like that, the same way, and I needed to tell you that because I haven't heard it in 10 months and it means more than you could possibly know." Her voice cracked on the last words and she felt tears spilling over, and she probably looked completely unhinged, standing there crying at a stranger in a cafe at 8 in the morning. And she was about to apologize and run away when the old man's face just crumpled. His eyes filled up instantly, and he stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. And he said, "Please, sit down. I need to hear more about him, about why that song matters." And his voice was shaking, and Aubrey was so surprised by the intensity of his reaction that she just sat down in the empty chair. And the old man sat back down across from her and said, "I'm Jimmy Oakes. This is my granddaughter Kyla. I'm raising her because my son died a year and a half ago, and I'm 62 years old and I have no idea what I'm doing. And every single day I'm terrified I'm screwing her up because I'm too old and too tired, and I don't know how to be a parent again." The words came out in this rush like he'd been holding them in forever, and Kyla looked up from her coloring with an expression that suggested she'd heard this anxiety before, and Aubrey just sat there stunned. "I'm Aubrey Patterson. My dad was Richard. He died 10 months ago. Heart attack, completely sudden, and I haven't been able to cry about it until just now because hearing you hum his song broke something open in me that's been stuck." She wiped her face with a napkin from the dispenser, and Jimmy was crying too, and they were both just sitting there weeping in Brennan's cafe, while Kyla colored a picture of a horse very seriously like crying adults was a normal Tuesday for her. Jimmy said, "The fact that something I do, something unconscious, reminded you of a good father, that means maybe I'm not completely failing at this. Maybe I'm doing something right even when it doesn't feel like it." And his voice was so raw with hope and desperation that Aubrey felt something shift in her chest. They talked for 45 minutes. Aubrey told him about her dad, about how he'd been a high school history teacher for 30 years, about how he'd taught her to change a tire and balance a checkbook and make his mom's lasagna recipe, about how she'd taken for granted that he'd always be there until he wasn't. And Jimmy listened, like every word mattered, like he was taking notes for some test he was scared of failing. Jimmy told her about his son Derek, who'd been killed in a construction accident, about how Derek's wife had struggled with addiction and wasn't capable of raising Kyla, about how Jimmy had retired early from the Postal Service to take custody, and now he was living on a fixed income, trying to raise a second grader when he could barely see to help with her homework. Kyla finished her coloring and pushed it across the table to Aubrey, a purple horse with a rainbow mane, and said, "This is for you because you're sad, and horses make people happy." And Aubrey started crying all over again, and Jimmy said, "She's right, horses do help. We can't afford one, but the coloring's free. When Aubrey finally looked at her phone, she realized she was 20 minutes late for work and had to run. But before she left, she said, would it be okay if I came back and talked to you again? This helped more than I can explain. And Jimmy said, please, I'd really like that. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're here same time every week. And Aubrey nodded and grabbed her stuff and ran out feeling lighter than she had in almost a year. And in her car, before starting the engine, she looked at the purple horse drawing and thought maybe this is what connecting with grief looks like. Maybe it's letting a stranger's kindness crack you open enough to finally feel something real. What started as a chance encounter over a hum song turned into something neither Aubrey nor Jimmy expected. And over the next 6 weeks, their Tuesday and Thursday morning coffee meetings became the most important part of both their weeks. But what they didn't see coming was how one person's suspicion would nearly destroy the fragile family they were building. And by the time Jimmy's daughter showed up unannounced, everything good they'd created was about to come crashing down in the worst possible way. Aubrey started showing up at Brennan's cafe 15 minutes earlier than she used to just to make sure she got enough time with Jimmy and Kyla before she had to leave for work. And those conversations became the thing that finally made her feel like she could breathe again after 10 months of suffocating in grief that had nowhere to go. They talk about everything and nothing. Jimmy would tell stories about his son Derek, about the time Derek was 12 and tried to build a treehouse that immediately fell apart, about how Derek had wanted to be an astronaut until he discovered he got motion sickness on the tilt-a-whirl. And Aubrey would share memories of her dad, about how he'd cry at every single one of her school plays, even when she was just playing tree number 3, about how he'd leave sticky notes with terrible dad jokes in her lunch bag all through high school. Kyla would sit there coloring or doing homework while the adults talked, and sometimes she'd pipe up with questions like, "What's your dad's name?" And Aubrey would say, "Richard, but everyone called him Rick." And Kyla would nod very seriously like she was filing that information away for later. One Thursday in mid-April, Kyla was struggling with a reading worksheet, getting frustrated because the words weren't making sense, and Jimmy was trying to help, but Aubrey could see him squinting at the paper, holding it at arm's length. And he finally admitted, "My eyes aren't what they used to be. I can barely read this small print. And I can't afford glasses right now because Kyla needed new shoes, and her dental checkup wiped out what I'd saved." Aubrey watched Kyla's face fall as she realized Papa couldn't help her. And something in Aubrey's chest just ached because this little girl had already lost so much, and now she was watching her grandfather struggle with something as basic as reading homework. And before she could think about whether it was appropriate, Aubrey said, "I could help if you want. I'm pretty good with reading stuff. Used to tutor kids in high school." Jimmy's face did this complicated thing where relief and pride and embarrassment all crashed together, and he said, "I couldn't ask you to do that. Kyla's mom hasn't called in 6 months, and I've been doing this alone. You've already given us so much just by showing up." And Aubrey said, "You didn't ask, I offered. There's a difference." They settled on Aubrey coming over to Jimmy's apartment on Wednesday evenings after her shift, just for an hour, to help Kyla with reading and homework. And the first time Aubrey showed up at the address Jimmy had texted her, she pulled into this apartment complex that had definitely seen better decades. The kind of place where the parking lot has more potholes than pavement, and the building paint is peeling in long, sad strips. Jimmy's apartment was on the second floor, and when he opened the door, he looked embarrassed, said, "It's not much, but it's what we can afford on my Social Security and Derek's life insurance payout." And Aubrey stepped inside and saw a space that was small, but incredibly clean. Everything worn but cared for. Kyla's school artwork covering the fridge. A TV that was probably from 2005. Furniture that looked like it came from Goodwill. Kyla was so excited to show Aubrey her room that she grabbed her hand and dragged her down the hallway, chattering about her stuffed animal collection. And Aubrey sat on the floor of this tiny bedroom, helping an 8-year-old sound out words, while Jimmy made them all boxed mac and cheese for dinner, and it felt more like family than anything Aubrey had experienced since her dad died. This became their routine. Wednesdays at 6 o'clock, Aubrey would show up with her work bag still on her shoulder. Kyla would run to the door. They'd work on homework for an hour while Jimmy cooked something simple. And then Aubrey would stay for dinner because Jimmy insisted. And honestly, she didn't want to go home to her empty apartment anyway. 6 weeks into this arrangement, Aubrey realized she was in deep. Realized that Kyla had started calling her Miss Aubrey and drawing pictures specifically for her and asking Papa every Wednesday morning if Miss Aubrey was still coming over that night. And Jimmy had started relying on her for more than just homework help. He'd ask her opinion on whether Kyla's cough sounded bad enough for the doctor, whether the permission slip for the field trip seemed legit, how to handle Kyla's nightmares about her dad. Aubrey knew she was filling the daughter-shaped hole her father had left, knew she was recreating the relationship she'd lost by stepping into this found family, and her therapist had asked her point blank, "Are you helping Kyla, or are you trying to go back in time and be your dad's little girl again?" And Aubrey had said, "Can it be both?" And her therapist had just written something in her notes without answering. The whole thing came apart on a Wednesday in late May when Aubrey showed up at Jimmy's apartment at 6:15 and knocked on the door and heard voices inside. Not just Jimmy and Kyla, but a woman's voice that was sharp and tense. And when Jimmy opened the door, his face was pale and stressed, and behind him stood a woman in her early 40s, wearing business casual, and an expression that could freeze lava. "Aubrey, this is my daughter Lisa. She drove up from Chicago for a surprise visit. Lisa, this is Aubrey Patterson. She's been helping Kyla with her homework." And the way Jimmy said it sounded apologetic, like he was already defending something he shouldn't have to defend. Lisa looked Aubrey up and down with eyes that were cataloging every detail, and Kyla ran up yelling, "Miss Aubrey, you're here!" and threw her arms around Aubrey's waist, and Lisa's expression went from suspicious to outright hostile in about 2 seconds flat. "Dad, can we talk in the kitchen for a minute?" And it wasn't really a question, and Jimmy gave Aubrey this helpless look and followed his daughter, and Aubrey stood there in the living room with Kyla, who was oblivious, pulling out her backpack to show the spelling test she got a B+ on. From the kitchen, Aubrey could hear Lisa's voice getting louder, not quite yelling but close. "Who is this woman? How long has this been going on? Do you even know anything about her? She could be anyone. Dad, you're 62 years old and clearly lonely and vulnerable." Jimmy's voice was quieter, harder to hear, but Aubrey caught fragments. "She's been kind to us. She's helping Kyla. There's nothing inappropriate." And Lisa shot back, "That's what people say when they're being scammed. You don't see it because you're emotionally compromised. She's probably after your money or worse." Aubrey felt her face burning hot with humiliation and anger, and she wanted to march into that kitchen and tell Lisa exactly where she could shove her accusations. But Kyla was right there, looking confused, asking, "Why is Aunt Lisa mad?" And Aubrey couldn't do that to her. She stayed for another 10 minutes that were excruciating, helped Kyla with 2 math problems, while Lisa watched from the doorway with her arms crossed. And then she made an excuse about needing to leave early and got out of there before she said something she'd regret. Jimmy texted her that night, "I'm so sorry about Lisa. She's worried about me. She doesn't understand. Can we talk tomorrow?" And Aubrey wrote back, "Yeah, of course, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. She felt exposed and accused, and like maybe Lisa was right. Maybe she was taking advantage of a lonely old man, even if that hadn't been her intention. Thursday morning came, and Aubrey went to the cafe at the usual time, and Jimmy wasn't there. And he wasn't there the following Tuesday either. And when she texted him asking if everything was okay, he responded 3 hours later with, "Taking a break from our routine. Need to focus on family stuff. Thanks for understanding." Aubrey read that text message about 15 times, trying to find some hidden meaning that wasn't just rejection, but there was no other way to interpret it. Jimmy was pulling away because his daughter had convinced him that Aubrey was some kind of threat, and the worst part was Aubrey understood. She got why a grieving 62-year-old raising his granddaughter alone would listen to his adult daughter's concerns, would second-guess a friendship that had formed fast and felt intense, would worry that he was being naive or manipulated. Understanding it didn't make it hurt any less, though, and Aubrey spent the next week going through the motions at work, feeling like she'd lost her dad all over again. That same gutted, empty feeling of someone being there one day and gone the next. Her therapist asked how she was doing with the Jimmy situation, and Aubrey said, "I'm fine. It was probably getting too codependent anyway, healthy to have boundaries." And even as she said it, she knew it was garbage, knew she was doing the thing, where she pretended not to care, so it would hurt less. 2 weeks of silence turned into 3, and Aubrey stopped going to Brennan's cafe completely because the thought of running into Jimmy and having to make small talk like they were strangers was more than she could handle, and she started going to the Starbucks near work instead, even though their coffee tasted like burnt sadness. Kyla's purple horse drawing was still on Aubrey's fridge, and every time she saw it, she felt this wave of grief mixed with anger. Grief for the connection she'd lost and anger at Lisa for ruining it. Anger at Jimmy for not fighting harder to keep it. Anger at herself for getting so attached in the first place. What Aubrey didn't know was that across town, Jimmy was sitting in his apartment watching Kyla struggle with her reading homework and getting frustrated to the point of tears. And he was trying to help, but his vision was worse now and his patience was thinner because he hadn't slept well in weeks. And Kyla finally threw her pencil down and said, "I want Miss Aubrey. Why doesn't she come anymore? Did I do something wrong?" Jimmy's heart cracked right down the middle and he said, "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Miss Aubrey is just busy with her own life." And Kyla looked at him with those big brown eyes and said, "You're lying. Aunt Lisa said something mean, and now Miss Aubrey doesn't like us." And Jimmy couldn't even deny it because his 8-year-old granddaughter had figured out what he'd been trying to pretend wasn't true. That night after Kyla went to bed, Jimmy sat in his recliner, staring at his phone with Aubrey's contact pulled up, thumb hovering over the call button. And he kept hearing Lisa's voice in his head saying, "Dad, you're vulnerable. She's young and has her whole life ahead of her. Why would she want to spend time with you unless she's getting something out of it?" He'd pushed Aubrey away because some part of him believed Lisa was right, believed he was too old and too broken to deserve that kind of friendship, believed that eventually Aubrey would figure out he wasn't worth the effort and leave anyway. So why not end it now before Kyla got more attached? But sitting there in the dark, he realized the only person who'd gotten hurt by that logic was Kyla, and maybe himself too, and he had absolutely no idea how to fix what he'd broken. 3 weeks of silence can feel like 3 years when you're grieving twice over, and Jimmy Oakes was about to learn that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong and show up anyway, even when you're terrified of rejection. But what finally pushed him to act wasn't his own pain. It was watching his granddaughter ask the one question he couldn't answer. And sometimes it takes losing something to realize you were holding on to exactly what you needed all along. Jimmy had been going through the motions for 21 days, pretending like everything was fine, getting Kyla to school, picking her up, helping with homework that neither of them could really manage, making dinners that were getting progressively worse because he was too exhausted to care if mac and cheese came out of a box for the 4th time that week. Kyla's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called him in for a meeting on a Thursday afternoon and said with that careful voice teachers use when they're worried, "Mr. Oakes, Kyla's reading scores have dropped significantly in the past month. She's not participating in class discussions anymore, and yesterday she cried during silent reading time. Is everything okay at home?" And Jimmy wanted to say yes, everything's fine, but instead what came out was, "I messed up. I pushed away someone who was helping us because my daughter convinced me I was being naive, and now Kyla's paying the price for my insecurity." Mrs. Henderson had been teaching 2nd grade for 15 years and had seen every kind of family situation imaginable. And she said something that hit Jimmy right in the chest. "Kids are resilient, but they're not stupid. They know when the adults in their lives are scared. And right now, Kyla thinks she did something wrong to make Miss Aubrey leave. You need to fix that for her sake, if not your own." Jimmy drove home from that meeting with his hands shaking on the steering wheel, thinking about how he'd spent the past 3 weeks believing he was protecting Kyla by keeping distance from Aubrey, when really he'd just been protecting himself from the vulnerability of needing someone, and his granddaughter was the one suffering for it. That night he tried to talk to Kyla about it, sat down on her bed while she was getting ready to sleep and said, "Bug, I need to tell you something about Miss Aubrey. She didn't leave because of anything you did. She left because I made a mistake and pushed her away when I should have fought to keep her around." Kyla looked at him with those big brown eyes that were too wise for 8 years old and said, "Aunt Lisa said Miss Aubrey was trying to trick you, but I don't think that's true. I think she just missed her daddy, and we made her feel better like she made us feel better. Why can't you just say you miss her instead of pretending everything's fine?" And Jimmy had absolutely no answer for that because his 8-year-old granddaughter had just summarized the entire situation with more clarity than he'd managed in 3 weeks. He called Lisa the next morning, and when she answered with her usual brisk, "Hey, Dad, what's up?" he said without preamble, "You were wrong about Aubrey, and I was wrong for listening to you. She wasn't scamming me or taking advantage. She was grieving her father, and we were grieving Derek, and we found something good in each other, and I let you convince me that good things don't happen to people like me." Lisa was quiet for a long second, and then she said in a smaller voice, "Dad, I was scared. I've been scared since Derek died, that I'm going to lose you too. And I felt guilty for not taking Kyla myself. And seeing you get close to a stranger felt like you were replacing our family with someone else's." Jimmy's anger deflated a little bit because he understood that Lisa's suspicion had come from her own grief and guilt about not being able to raise her niece. And he said, "I'm not replacing anything. I'm just trying to survive raising a second grader at 62 with eyes that don't work and patience that runs out by noon. And Aubrey showed up and helped without asking for anything in return. That's called friendship, Lisa. And I need you to trust that I can tell the difference between someone who cares and someone who's using me." Lisa's voice cracked when she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to ruin something good for you. Have you talked to her? Does she know you want her back?" And Jimmy said, "Not yet. I'm terrified she won't forgive me. Wouldn't blame her if she didn't." He spent 2 days trying to figure out how to reach out to Aubrey, drafted about 15 text messages that all sounded either pathetic or desperate, considered just showing up at the cafe and hoping she'd be there. Finally decided that this required an actual face-to-face conversation where he could look her in the eye and own what he'd done. He remembered she worked at the CVS on Howell Avenue, and on a Saturday morning, when his neighbor could watch Kyla for an hour, he drove over there feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff, walked into the pharmacy section, and saw Aubrey behind the counter in her white coat helping an elderly customer with a prescription question. She looked tired, and when she glanced up and saw him standing there, her face went through this rapid sequence of surprise, hurt, and then careful neutrality. And Jimmy's heart was pounding so hard he thought he might actually pass out right there in the cold medicine aisle. He waited until she was done with the customer and then walked up to the counter. And before she could say anything, he said, "Aubrey, I need to talk to you, and I know you're working, but if you have a break or when your shift ends, I'll wait however long it takes. I messed up, and I need to tell you that to your face." Aubrey stared at him for a long moment and then said to her coworker, "Jenny, can you cover for 10 minutes?" and walked out from behind the counter and headed toward the break room without checking if Jimmy was following. And he followed her into the sad little room with a microwave and a table and chairs that didn't match. And the second the door closed, Aubrey turned on him. 3 weeks, Jimmy, you disappeared for 3 weeks. No explanation beyond family stuff. Do you have any idea what that felt like? I lost my dad 10 months ago, and then I lost you and Kyla, and it was like losing him all over again. And the worst part is I get it. I understand why you pulled away. Your daughter thinks I'm some kind of con artist, and you believed her, because why wouldn't you?" Her voice was shaking, and Jimmy could see she was trying not to cry. And he said, "You're right, about all of it. Lisa convinced me you had ulterior motives, and I believed her, because I've spent the past year and a half feeling like I'm failing at everything, and accepting help from you felt too good to be real. So when she said you were probably using me, part of me thought, yeah, that makes sense. Nobody that kind would want to spend time with a broke 62-year-old and his traumatized granddaughter unless they were getting something out of it." Aubrey's face crumpled and she said, "I was getting something out of it. I was using you to avoid dealing with my dad's death. Being around you and Kyla made me feel like I had a family again. Like I could be someone's daughter even if it wasn't my actual father. And my therapist called me out on it, said I was substituting you for the grief work I didn't want to do." They both stood there in that break room looking at each other. And Jimmy said, "So we were both using each other. I was using you to feel like I wasn't completely screwing up as a parent, and you were using me to avoid your grief. Does that mean what we had wasn't real?" Aubrey wiped her eyes and said, "No. I think it means it was real, but also complicated, and maybe we both needed to step back and figure out what we actually want from this instead of just filling holes in each other's lives." Jimmy took a breath and said, "I want you back in our lives. Kyla's reading scores dropped, She cried at school. She asked me why I can't just say, I miss you, instead of pretending everything's fine. And she's right, I need you, Aubrey. Not as a replacement daughter and not as free tutoring for Kyla. I need you as family, the kind you choose. And I'm sorry I was too scared and insecure to fight for that 3 weeks ago. Aubrey was full on crying now and she said, I need you too, but I also need to do the actual work of processing my dad's death instead of just finding a substitute. My therapist wants me in a grief support group, and I need space to do that while also being in your life. Can we do both? Can we be family without me using you as a band-aid? Jimmy said, yeah, I think we can figure that out. I'm in a caregiver support group for grandparents raising grandkids. Met every Tuesday night. Maybe we both need our own things, and then we come together from a healthier place. They stood there for another minute just breathing, and then Aubrey said, I really missed you guys. I have Kyla's purple horse drawing on my fridge, and every time I see it I want to cry. And Jimmy laughed wetly and said, she's been drawing you pictures every week, and I have a stack of them on the kitchen counter. She made me promise to give them to you if you ever came back. They made a plan right there in the CVS break room. Wednesdays at 6, Aubrey would come over for homework help and dinner, but also she'd go to her grief group on Thursdays and have her own life on weekends, and they'd check in regularly to make sure nobody was falling into old patterns of avoidance or codependence, and it felt like the first actually healthy boundary Aubrey had set in months. That Wednesday when she showed up at Jimmy's apartment, Kyla screamed and ran to the door and launched herself at Aubrey's legs, and Aubrey knelt down and said, I'm sorry I disappeared, bug. That wasn't fair to you. I'm back now, and I'm going to try really hard to not disappear again. And Kyla said, okay, but you have to see all my drawings, and dragged her inside. Over the next year, they built something that looked like family but didn't fit any traditional definition. Aubrey helped with homework and came to Kyla's school events. Jimmy introduced Aubrey to his grief support group when she mentioned wanting to try it. And on Father's Day, Aubrey did something that felt both painful and healing. She went to her dad's grave in the morning and sat there for an hour telling him about her life, about Jimmy and Kyla, about how loving them didn't mean she'd forgotten him. Then she drove to Jimmy's apartment and they had lunch, just the three of them. And Kyla gave Jimmy a card she'd made that said, Best Papa Ever, with approximately 17 glitter hearts. And Jimmy looked at Aubrey and said, your dad would be proud of you, the way you showed up for us, the way you're doing the hard work of grieving while still letting yourself love people. Lisa came to visit in August and met Aubrey for real this time, and it was awkward but not hostile. Lisa apologized stiffly, and Aubrey accepted it with the understanding that trust takes time to rebuild. And they weren't friends, but they were working towards something like mutual respect for Kyla's sake. Aubrey brought her mom to meet Jimmy in September, and her mom and Jimmy hit it off, talking about the impossible task of loving people after loss. And suddenly their little chosen family expanded to include Aubrey's mom, who started coming to Wednesday dinner sometimes. And it was messy and imperfect, and nothing like what any of them had planned, but it worked. On a random Thursday in October, Aubrey was at Brennan's Cafe getting coffee before work, and she heard someone humming Stand By Your Man, and she turned around and saw Jimmy at his usual table with Kyla doing homework, and he saw her and smiled and waved her over, and she sat down with them for 20 minutes before she had to leave, and it felt full circle in a way that made her chest ache in the good way. Jimmy said, I've been teaching Kyla about her dad, showing her pictures, telling her stories, and I realize I can honor Derek by being the best papa I can be, same way you honor your dad by loving people even when it's scary. And Aubrey said, yeah, I'm learning that grief doesn't mean stopping. It means expanding, making room for new people while keeping the old ones alive in how we love. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build in a cafe over a hummed song and shared grief and the willingness to show up imperfectly. Jimmy learned that accepting help isn't weakness, and Aubrey learned that loving new people doesn't erase the ones you lost, and Kyla learned that family can look 100 different ways and still be real. If this story reminded you that grief can be a bridge instead of a wall, that chosen family matters just as much as blood family, and that it's okay to need people even when it's terrifying, hit that subscribe button, Drop a comment about someone who became family when you needed it most, and share this with anyone who's learning to love again after loss. Thanks for being here with us. We'll see you in the next one.